Welcome. Good to have you here. Um, if this is your first time, then my name is Jose. And if you've been here before, then it's good to have you back. Um, Now, consequences, right? Things have consequences, right? We all know this. And one of the most consequential things is child abuse, right? Um, we're all very familiar with the devastating effects of child abuse. Um, but today we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into how the effects of child abuse, right, affect our health when we grow up, right, and we're no longer children, and we're in our adulthood, then what are the effects, right? If we experience childhood trauma, what are the effects on our health, on our overall health? So that's what we're going to talk about today, all right? So now, for us to understand these effects, um, first we have to understand what happens inside of us when we're being abused. Okay. Um, so one of the obviously we're gonna look at the brain, right? The nervous system, and one of the primary thing that is affected during child abuse, right? It's our uh, flight fight or flight response, right? That is our internal alarm system. Um, just like when you face any threats, right? Anything threatening, um, your alarm system, right? Inside, right, is activated. It kicks in, right? It kicks in, right? An area of the brain called the limbic system, right, is the interior of the brain, right? It's in the center of the brain, near the brain stem. That is the most primitive part of the brain, right? Is similar, right? Is similar to other animals, right? The rest of the animal kingdom, other mammals, right? They share uh, the same part of the brain called the limbic system. All right. So what happens, right, when you see something frightening, right? Something frightening. Well, you have an area of the brain called the amygdala, right? The amygdala is responsible for reacting, right? Helps you react to something that is threatening, right? So the amygdala is involved in um, recognizing threats, right? But also remembering threats, right? It's also involved in memory, okay? So when we are abused as children, right? What happens to the amygdala? Okay, so the amygdala, uh, you know, they have done um, scans, right, on people that were abused, right? They have suffered child abuse, and they noticed that their amygdala was larger than people that were not abused. Okay, so the amygdala, if it's damaged, right? And I'm going to tell you how before I go on. How is it damaged? Okay, so you have the amygdala. We're going to talk about the amygdala today. We're going to talk about the nucleus accumbens, right? And we're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex, okay? These three areas of the brain, okay, are uh, are can be damaged, right? Are damaged through childhood trauma. And what happens? Okay, what happens? Uh, so how are first of all, how are they damaged? Right? Let's talk about that first. How are they damaged? Um, okay, so going back, right? You see a threat, right? The alarm system inside of us, right, kicks in, and uh, it signals, right? The hypothalamus, which is another part of the limbic system, signals our adrenal glands, right? That they sit on top of our kidneys, right? Those little glands that you learned about in school, the adrenal glands, right? The hypothalamus, which is part of the limbic system, instructs the adrenal glands to produce um, adrenaline, as you know, adrenaline, right? And cortisol, okay, and cortisol, right? Now, cortisol, right, um, is a hormone, right, like adrenaline, right? And it's involved in pumping the body up, right, for the threat, right? Um, and what happens is, the system, right? It gets us ready for the threat, right? Our heart rate increases, right? So more blood could be sent to the muscles, right? In case you gotta run, okay, or in case you have to fight. Um, Another thing that happens, right, is our breathing, right? Our breath rate increases, right? So we can get more oxygen, right, into our lungs and into our blood. Um, Also, our pupils dilate, right? So we can see our threat, right? So we could better see our threat. And our digestion shuts down. So more energy can be spent on more important um, organs and functions at that moment of emergency, right? Like more energy can be spent on the heart, the lungs, right? And also, excuse me, and more energy is also spent on the limbic system itself, right? More blood goes to the limbic system instead of the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is the thinking, uh, rationalizing part of the brain. So more blood also goes to the limbic system, which is involved in the fight or flight response. Okay? So what happens, right? Now, it's an alarm system, right? We hear alarm systems, and alarm system supposed to just, operate once in a while, right? Uh, we don't hear alarm system operating day after day after day, right? Imagine that, right? That we see, for example, uh, the fire trucks going off every single day, running around the neighborhood. That'd be pretty disorienting, right? And if we hear an alarm in our building, right, like a fire alarm going off every single day, that'll be pretty disorienting as well. Well, that's what happens inside a person, inside a child that is suffering child abuse. That's what happens to a child. That's one of the consequences of child abuse is this alarm system, this emergency response, right? Called the fight or flight response, the fight and flight response, going off all the time, all the time, all the time, because there's always a threat. Is a home, right? Uh, it could be a home, it could be somewhere else, but usually a home when it is ongoing, chronic, every day, right? So the limbic system is instructing the release of cortisol, right? Constantly, it's constant in the blood. During normal times, right? the cortisol rises, right? And so does the adrenaline. We respond to the threat, and normally it's supposed to just subside, right? The threat is gone, the cortisol levels are back down, and everything's supposed to be back to normal. But when you're being abused, this is not the case, right? The cortisol is always high, right? It's always a high level of cortisol in the blood and in the brain. So this has a damaging effect, right? This amount of cortisol in the blood has damaging effects, right? It damages critical areas of the brain like the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. Okay, all right. So what can happen, right? What are the consequences, right, of child mistreatment? What are the consequences? And we're talking here emotional consequences. Yes, right. There are emotional consequences, which are some of the most painful consequences, right? But there are also physical consequences to our physical health. All right. So I'm going to explain to you how that is. So when the amygdala, right, is damaged due to prolonged exposure to stress and cortisol, um, now we become hyper vigilant, right? Everything is perceived, right, as a threat, right? Now remember, the amygdala is also involved in learning, right? So it learns, like for example, right? My mother was abusive, right? My amygdala also remember that, you know, she was in this case, right? In my case, it was my mother that was mostly physically abusive and verbally abusive, right? So my amygdala, right, remember that threat, right? So you remember that threat, and it was in this case a woman, right? In my case, a woman, my mother. So that made me apprehensive, right? If I will see an angry woman, uh, I will get tense, right? I will get tense. I would, you know, I would, maybe freeze, right? I will freeze or leave, try to leave the situation. But I will definitely my fight and flight response will be activated, right? If I see a woman that's upset, that's angry, because my amygdala remember that as a threat, right? An angry mother, right? An angry mother, right? But I'm giving you the most basic, right? Of course, my amygdala is pretty much afraid of people in general, right? Because and this is very common. This is absolutely common with survivors of child abuse, right? We are apprehensive. We are afraid of people in general because that's what our amygdala learned, right? It learned that people can hurt you, right? People can hurt you, and that's how the amygdala is involved, right? It becomes it causes us to be hyper vigilant about people, and what are they doing? What are they thinking, right? What are they thinking about me? What are they planning something? Our thinking is always involved. A lot of the time is involved in that cycle, right? What are they thinking of me? Are they planning something? Okay, so that's our amygdala, right? That's our amygdala. When it becomes damaged, it becomes hypersensitive, right? We're hyper vigilant, right? And whatever traumatizes whoever, that is also remembered by the amygdala, right? And it might misjudge, like you could see a person that's upset, but they're not upset at you, but I could misjudge that person as being a threat to me because my amygdala remembers he learns something and it applies it to other situations in the present. Okay. Now, what can happen, right? Well, if I'm hypervigilant, right, I'm always under stress, right? I'm always stressed. I'm always tense, right? And stress is, is linked, right? Is linked with uh, cardiovascular disease, right? Hypertension, okay? Some very, very serious consequences, right? Even cancer, because stress suppresses the immune system, right? And the immune system, a suppressed immune system can result, in when the immune system attacks the body, right? It could cause the immune system to attack the body itself, okay? So, as you can see, right, a damaged amygdala, you can see, and that's the physical consequences. Now, behavioral consequences, if I'm always under stress, I might be looking for something to help me calm down the stress, right? So I may self-medicate, right? I may drink too much, or I may do drugs, and that in itself, right? Too much drinking has been linked with cancer, right? Liver failure, right? And we're all familiar with how drugs can affect the body, right? Uh, drug behaviors involving drug, there's the risk of contracting diseases like HIV, hepatitis. It could also result in liver damage, liver failure, right, and overdose, right, and death. Okay, so that's what could result, right, from a damaged amygdala. All that I explained to you. Now, another area of the brain of the limbic system, right? The nucleus accumbens, right? Now, this is an important part involved in the pleasure and reward part of the brain, right? Pleasure and reward, right? Now, uh, this is involved, right? This part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, is involved in the delay of gratification, right? Very important, right? Delay of gratification. Okay, so I see that I could get this quickly now, right? But if I wait and I work a little more, right, I could get this better reward, right? That is better for me, right? Better for my life. Now, when this area of the brain is damaged, right, the nucleus accumbens is damaged, then I have problems being patient, right? I have problems being patient. I have problems with delay of gratification. I want what I want now, and I want it now. I don't want to wait, right? And this is implicated in addiction, right? Damage to the nucleus accumbens is implicated in addiction, right? Whether it's drug addiction, or whether it's food addiction, or a shopping addiction, right? Um, the this damage to this area of the brain is implicated in all forms of addiction, right? Now we know addictions, right? Addiction to drugs, addiction to alcohol, right? Have some serious health consequences, right? Like cardiovascular disease when we're talking about food addiction, obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, right? When we're talking about alcohol, liver failure, cancer, heart disease as well. When we're talking about drugs, we just talked about those, right? You know, uh, Contracting HIV, uh, uh, hepatitis, overdosing, death, right? All those. So we can see how serious it can be to have our nucleus accumbens damage, right? By too much stress, ongoing stress, right? Ongoing stress, right? Now, another thing, besides the obvious, health risk, there's also behavioral consequences, right? Because if I'm not patient, right, I may take risks, right? I engage in risky behavior, right? Maybe unprotected sex, right? Not thinking of the consequences, right? And again, risky behaviors with drugs and alcohol and all types of risky behavior, because I'm not looking at the consequences, right? I'm not delaying gratification. So, damage to this area of the brain, uh, can make me take more risk, right? Unnecessary risk, right? Dangerous risks. Okay, very good. So now the other part of the brain that I want to talk to you about is the prefrontal cortex, right? This is the part of the brain, right, that is involved in learning, right? Learning, executive actions, thinking, reasoning, right? And now before I go on, I want to explain to you a relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, right? The amygdala is impulsive, right? That's the amygdala, right? When you see a threat, an immediate threat, you have to react quick, right? That's the nature of the amygdala. But as we talked about, a damaged amygdala, right, could misjudge things as threatening when they're not really threatening, right? That's what a damaged amygdala does, right? you know it just sees danger where there is really no danger, right? So that is the job of the prefrontal cortex, right? To remind the amygdala, right, that this is not really a threat. We don't have to worry about this, right? uh, that's the job of the prefrontal cortex, right? The reasoning part, right, of our brain, right? And mitigates, right? It mitigates the impulses of the amygdala. Okay? So I think you could tell that if we have a damaged prefrontal cortex, right, which happens with child abuse, right, too much stress, ongoing stress, too much cortisol, a damaged prefrontal cortex is not able to mitigate the impulsive uh, damaged amygdala. So we have an amygdala that's afraid of everything, right? Hypervigilant. And then we have the other part of the brain that's supposed to, right? Supposed to mitigate the impulses of the amygdala. That part is also damaged, right? So there's really, it's weakened, right? The ability of our prefrontal cortex to subdue the impulses, the amygdala, that ability is greatly compromised. So what happens? Well, we are impulsive, right? We're impulsive, right? We react, right? A damaged prefrontal cortex means that we react, we are impulsive. uh, our emotions, right, that come from the amygdala, the fear or the anger is overwhelming, right? It's overwhelming. We cannot control it, right? And it ranges, right? It ranges from uh, not controlling and not being able to control it at all, right? To somewhat control it, but we're always tense, we're always angry, we hold it in, which in itself can cause damage, right? Because as we spoke a minute ago about how stress can damage our health, right? So a damaged prefrontal cortex, the amygdala is not in check, right? So we are overwhelmed by fear or anger, rage. We're impulsive. We react without thinking. We react to situations, blow things out of proportion, and we all know what the consequences of that can be, right? Uh, Damage to our health, right? Damage to our health, because living in that constant state, right, of anger or fear, right? That is stressful. That is stressful, and we already mentioned what stress can do, right? It is the, it leads to the number, the most common causes of death, right? Which is cardiovascular disease, uh, cancer, right? So that's what can happen with a damaged prefrontal cortex, right? I am not able to control my impulses. I get mad. I get overwhelmed by anger. I react because that part of the brain is damaged. Okay, so these are the consequences, right? These are the consequences of child mistreatment on our behavior and our health, right? So even if we don't react, even if we do not react, there there are there are consequences to our health, right? Because the stress alone, right, of an ongoing uh, fight or flight response is always on, because it's hypersensitive. Remember, the amygdala is hypersensitive, and just the stress of that alone, it does great damage to our health, right? It does great damage to our heart, great damage, great damage by causing diseases, okay? Because it could cause us to eat more, right? And stress also, right, causes us to burn less fuel, right? Somehow our bodies think that we're under threat, so we gotta save fuel, right? And what happens is we gain weight, right? As a result of stress too, right? Because it shuts down uh, the burning of fuel. Okay. Now, another thing that I want to share with you, right, is now stress can affect what I already explained to you, but it could also affect the hormone system, right? The hormonal system itself. Too much cortisol can disrupt, right, the hormonal system. And what can happen with a disrupted hormonal system? Well, we could get diabetes, right? Too much insulin. Women can also have problems with their menstruations, right? Disruptions in menstruation or no menstruation at all. Okay, so these are problems, right, with a hormonal system, right? And like I mentioned earlier, it could also disrupt the immune system, right? A stress, just stress alone can uh, 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 interfere with the immune system, right? And a weakened immune system, more sickness. When we get sick, we get worse, right? Harder to recover, and even cancer, right? And even cancer. Okay. Now, what's another thing that can happen? Now, during childhood maltreatment, right, or childhood trauma, even our DNA is affected. Our DNA, okay. There was a study done. I'm gonna leave the link so you could read it for yourself. But a study was done on Civil War POWs, right? Prisoners of war, right? During the Civil War, right? And there were prisoners of war. They were captured, right? Now they study, right? They looked at their children, right? Their children when when the war was over and they had children, their own children, right, had an 11% increase death rate than the children of uh, those that were not prisoners of war. Okay, so the children of prisoners of war had an 11% increased death rate than the children of non-prisoners of war, right? And when they looked at the reason, it was brain hemorrhage, right? Brain hemorrhage, and that was one of the leading reasons. Okay, and they looked at other factors to make sure nothing else was contributing. They looked at the parents' socioeconomic status. They looked at the child's their job, their marital status, to make sure that that was not affecting the results. And they found out it was not affecting the results. Okay. And another study, and I'm also going to leave you the link for that. They looked at during World War II, right? The Nazis blocked the Netherlands, right? The Netherlands, they blocked them so they would not be able to get any food, right? So it resulted in famine, right? This happened in, I believe, October 1944. So they blocked the Netherlands from getting food, right? The Nazis during World War II, which resulted in famine, right? Now they looked at pregnant women. Pregnant women, what happened, right? What they believe happened. Oh, first of all, before I go on, the children of pregnant women, right, grew up to be overweight, right, and they were suffering from diabetes, right. The they were suffering from diseases, right, that result from being overweight, right, like diabetes, I believe cardiovascular disease, and so that, okay. Now what they came to think was that the genes, right, the genes in the DNA, right? They turn on or they turn off, right? They don't mutate, right? They don't mutate, right? They either turn on or they turn off. So depending on the trauma that's going on, in this case with these women that were pregnant and that were experiencing famine, right? They shut off the gene, right, in their baby. Their babies was still in their uterus, and the baby's gene that burns fuel was shut off so they could conserve fuel, right, because there was a famine going on. So what happens when they grew up, when these babies grew up, right, since this gene that burns fuel was shut off, okay, they gained weight, they became overweight, right, and they were suffering from heart disease, diabetes, etc. Okay. um so a trauma, right, can be passed down in our DNA. These two studies show, right, that trauma can turn off can turn on some genes, right, and can turn off other genes, right, and that is passed down to our children. Okay. And as you could see in these cases, in the case of the POWs, right, their children died at a higher rate than children whose parents were not POWs, right? So it does have some serious consequences, right? It has some serious consequences, right? I mean, it could have a consequence in our heart, right? The health of our heart, right? Maybe we could pass that down to our children, or maybe a gene that inhibits cancer. Maybe that gene is turned off for some reason, and maybe our children, uh, you know, can be a higher risk for a certain disease, right? Because we were traumatized. All right. So very, very important. I encourage you to look into these studies, okay? I encourage you to look into those studies. And before I leave you, I want to add, right? Uh, if you ever, I don't know if you heard of the ACE study, right? The study. It was created in the 90s, right? It has 10 categories, right? 10 different events that can happen during childhood, right? They are traumatic, right? That are traumatic. You take this study, right? You take this study, right? You answer yes, it happened. No, it did not happen. If you score, if a person scores, right? Most people score on this test, by the way. A lot of people in our society have been exposed to traumatic events, okay? A lot of people, okay? Many, many people. Now, if a person scores 4 or more, they are at risk. They are at risk. They're a heightened risk, okay, for depression, okay, the heightened risk for cardiovascular disease, okay, um, uh, they are at risk, okay, for various, right, various uh, health risks, right? Like I say, cardiovascular disease, cancer, okay, depression, suicide, and we're talking very significant, okay, very significant, okay, exponentially, okay, exponentially. That means we multiply the risk, right? So I'm gonna leave a link to the ACE study. I encourage you to take it. If you suffered child abuse or if you suffer any traumatic event, I encourage you to take this test so that you could be better informed. Okay, be better informed and take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. And you could better understand maybe why do I react this way, and maybe you have a better understanding. Or I feel depressed, and then you could connect that to maybe some adverse childhood experience that you experienced. Okay, so yes, the consequences of child mistreatment, right? The consequences of childhood trauma, they are very real. They affect us whether we think of about it or not. They affect us in a very fundamental way, in a very physical way. One thing that I want to remind you also, that the ACE study I was talking about, right? Uh, the more you score, the more things that happen, it could cut down our life expectancy by 20 years. Okay? 20 years could be taken off our lives, okay, by by childhood mistreatment, by child abuse. Okay, 20 years could be cut from our lives. Okay, we are at a greater risk than somebody that was not abused. Okay, so that is very, very, very powerful, very, very significant. Okay, so I encourage you to take this test. I encourage you to read the studies so you can get better understanding how trauma is passed down in the DNA to our own children. Okay, they're more susceptible. Okay, so to protect our own children, I encourage you to read these studies. Okay, so okay, so I'm gonna end it on that right now. If you found this important, and I hope you did because it is very important, please give it a like, okay? And if you are interested in more topics like this one, go ahead and subscribe, okay? And leave a comment, okay? Leave a comment. Are you aware of what I'm talking about here? Are you already aware of this? And how did you become aware of it? And tell me, share if you suffered child abuse, and how is it affecting you now? How are you being affected? How is it affecting your health right now? Uh, Maybe you were not aware of it. Did you make the connection by hearing this video? Did you make the connection that it is linked to maybe some traumatic event you went through during your childhood? All right. Okay. Now remember, the more we know, the better, right? We could make changes. We could make changes, right, to help ourselves. Okay. All right. So we're gonna leave it there, and please leave a comment. Okay. So I know what your thoughts are. Okay. All right. So until next time, you have a wonderful day. Take care.